this kind of feels like the big one. It feels like the last 6+ years of producing content and doing this podcast for over 210 episodes has, in a weird way, led up to this point here. My 30th birthday, the end of my 20s, the logical conclusion of wherever this has all been going for all of this time. And this is going to be a longer episode than usual. This is going to be a less structured episode than usual in some ways, because I just want to think out loud about the past decade of life, about turning 30, about what all of this means, and about where things go next. And to be clear, this isn't the end of the podcast just because I'm now 30, despite the past 6+ years having been about being in my 20s and learning out loud and figuring things out. All of that will continue. I just happen to have a different number at the beginning of my age now, right? I'm 30. This is my 30s, as surreal as it feels to say that. But I want to do a few things today. I want to try and reflect on the past decade and share with you the way that I have kind of tried to make sense of it in the past few weeks as I've been reflecting on what this decade of life has been about, what it's been for, and trying to pull out any sort of grand meaning from it. Spoiler, I don't think there is a grand meaning, but we'll come on to that. So I want to share with you how I've kind of made sense of where I've been for the past 10 years. And then as part of doing that, I want to pull out some lessons that just feel right to share. And when I say that just feel right to share, what I mean by that is I literally sat with a Google Doc for like 5 minutes and pulled out the things that came to the top of my head as the lessons that this decade has taught me, because I didn't want it to be too kind of effortful and contrived and this big thing. It's more just the lessons that stick. The good ones should be top of mind. So the things that were top of mind as I reflect on what my 20s have taught me are the things that I want to share at the end of this episode. But before we do that, I want to talk about kind of where I've been for the past decade, because I think I don't give myself enough credit oftentimes for just how much my life has changed, and actually just how much I have changed my life, right? Slight difference in wording there, but I think it makes all the difference. The beginning of my 20s were a really, really weird time, because as I said 200 plus episodes ago on the very first episode of this podcast, when I told you about my childhood and everything that had led up to the point of that first episode, my childhood was all right. We didn't have a lot of money, but it felt like a childhood. You know, I got to do all of the things that kids get to do. And yes, I ran businesses with Lewis and then later Zach. You know, I was doing things in my childhood and teen years that were slightly unusual, but I was, broadly speaking, just being a kid. And yet, when I got to my 20s, it feels like everything came to a head in a way that forced me to grow up really quickly. And on reflection, although I felt old back then because I was the oldest I had ever been, I'm not sure that I was ready to grow up at that point. At least I'm not sure I was ready for the number of things that happened all at once to happen and for me to bounce back in a resilient way. And what I mean by that is when I was thinking about those kind of 19, 20, 21, maybe 22, that kind of age bracket, when I was thinking about those times, as I kind of journaled to work out what this decade has been about, I call them the dark days, because a series of things happened back to back, which means that in a very real, literal sense, like those days were dark, right? So my dad, as you know, I'm sure, because I talk about it all the time, was ill, but we didn't know what was wrong with him at that point. And of course, we later found out he was later diagnosed with Alzheimer's. But before he was diagnosed, there was this really weird period where he had recently lost a job at the end of my teen years. And that job came with a house, which means that the main income for the family, plus the family home, which was the only house that I had ever known, vanished overnight. And so we moved to this new house, a new council house, and it was a council flat actually. And it felt for a moment like it could have been a new start, a fresh start, right? And my dad went looking for jobs and my mum was still working her job and I was when we moved to that flat, I was just finishing sixth form, so I was still in school. And in the very early days in that new flat, it felt like things might have been all right. But then my dad was slowly getting a little bit more ill as time was going on, right? We could tell that something wasn't right. And so that means that his ability to search for work, to have an income, vanished. And the more unwell he became, the more time my mum would be taking off work, which means that her ability to have an income vanished. And this sounds nuts. I've never told this story before, but there were days when I would be in Wales, and I must have been like 21 at the time, and my mum had shared with me her like telephone banking details, so just like her account number and sort code for me to check how much had gone into her bank each payday, because she doesn't have online banking. And there would be times at like 2 a.m, 3 a.m. on what would have been her payday when I'd phone up and her pay was there. Amazing. And there would be times where there was nothing there, not a penny. And the reason there was not a penny is increasingly the worse and worse my dad got prior to being diagnosed, the less my mum would go into work. And so there were periods where she would just not go to work for a month. And I don't think she was ready to confront the conversation with her employer that her husband was ill and she didn't quite know what to do. So she just, in a very human way, didn't go in. Wasn't earning anything because she was more focused, rightly, on looking after her husband. So my dad couldn't work, wasn't earning. My mum, in some ways, couldn't work, wasn't earning. And then I was very early on into this business thing, wasn't earning a great deal of money. And so when I say things were dark back then, and when I say that in a literal sense, it's because, you know, there were several times where we didn't have any money to put on the electric meter. You know, you run it down to zero, and then you have the £5 emergency credit, and you run that down to zero, and then you just don't have any electric or gas. You run that down to zero, and then you just don't have any gas. And, you know, there's stories that I tell that I still remember, as surreal as it now feels. It almost feels like another life. But there was a time when there was no food in the fridge. And I use the exact sentence when I say this every time, so forgive me if you've heard it before, but I don't mean there was like a bit of cheese and like some milk and this and that, like not a lot. There was nothing in the fridge. And I have a photo, I think, somewhere in my Dropbox of that. I need to dig that out one day. And similarly, fortunately, at a different time, there was a time where there was no food in the freezer. Again, literally no food. And I remember I was doing this like weird freelance project, probably at the age of like 20, I don't know, 21 possibly, of designing something. And we had no food in the house. We'd even made that last like struggle meal of pulling things from cupboards and a tiny bit of pasta and some peas and whatever it might be. There was nothing, and we had no money, and I had no access to money, and I knew nobody with money. And the freelance project finally, after weeks of me chasing, paid me probably like £120, I want to say it was. And that allowed me to go out and do a food shop, which kind of reset things. And all the while, layer into this, right? And it didn't make sense at the time, but it probably makes more sense now as I reflect. With the money that I did have, or my overdraft, if I didn't have the money, I would be going out and drinking as often as possible. I would be eating like the least balanced diet you could imagine. I used to joke that I'd live on Red Bulls and yogurts, and that sounds like a haha, no he didn't. No, I did. Like, I would just eat absolute rubbish, which is A, terrible for my health, but B, almost this weird, like, destructive spending habit when you have such little money to go out and buy these, like, packaged random fake foods that don't serve you or anybody else. And it sounds silly because I shouldn't beat myself up about it, but it's just like this really strange behavior when I think back to it. And there were periods in this dark, cold house with both of my parents really struggling. You could see the strain on their faces. You could see that they were physically aging going through this couple of years because it was so much before my dad was diagnosed. There were periods where I thought that I was really tired because I just couldn't get out of bed. And when I look back, given that as tired as I am these days from being busy and all the good things, I'm not entirely sure that was tiredness. I think that it was probably something closer to being a bit depressed, if I'm honest, right? And when I call them the dark days, it's not just at least because they were literally dark and cold and there wasn't a lot of food, but actually I felt at that point like there was no point and there was no hope, because I would watch these vlogs on YouTube, right? Gary Vaynerchuk growing his business and doing all this mad stuff, and I'd be like, oh, I want to be like him one day. Or I'd watch the original Stephen Bartlett vlogs back then, and probably in the same time frame, these kind of people, right? And I'd look at the lives that they had and the businesses they were building and the things that they were achieving, and inherently somewhere deep down I thought there's no reason why I can't run a successful business. Like, I felt in some weird, probably naive way like I had all of the requisite skills to go and do something interesting, but I just couldn't see a path there. I just couldn't work out how on earth I was ever going to get from the place I was, which felt lower than rock bottom in some ways, right? No income coming into the house, the electric getting cut off, no food, both my parents stressed, one of them very ill, me unable to get out of bed, not knowing how to move forward. I just couldn't possibly see how you go from there to, I guess, this, where I am now, right? And it's not without his struggles, it's not without his issues, it's not without his stress, but it honestly feels like another life. And so that was kind of the first chapter of my 20s. It started in a not very good place. It's probably one of the worst starts to your 20s you could possibly wish for. And then the next chapter I've called Getting Going, because something changed and I don't know what. But I remember it was the summer of 2018, which would have made me, 22-ish, I think, if I do the maths correctly. And I was in the Big Yellow in Cardiff, which, funnily enough, is like 4 buildings down from the apartment today. It's this funny full circle. I was in the Big Yellow in Cardiff, and we had just moved into a slightly bigger office for the business, and it looked really nice, and we had some clients, and we were making a little bit of money, and something just clicked in my mind where everything felt a little bit better. Now, crucially, at this point, my dad had been diagnosed, which means he could get the support he needed. He could get the financial assistance he needed. It allowed my mum to stop working and be his full-time carer and have some financial assistance to do that. So that big cloud was lifted. And that probably did me some favors in allowing me to see a little bit further forward, to start thinking, actually, let's start playing slightly longer term, because I was able to, right? It's easier to think about the bigger picture when your electric hasn't been cut off. It's easier to think about the bigger picture when you can afford dinner that day, or when your parents aren't sat in a cold house, unsure what to do next, feeling helpless, right? The emotional burden that was lifted, the stress that was lifted, allowed me to think a little bit more clearly. And at that time, by chance, I watched some YouTube video, and it was like, I can't think of the guy's name. It was a Mind Valley video. And I think this guy was interviewing maybe Neil Patel, the SEO guy. And he was like, hey, here are 5 books that you should read. And I was like, all right, cool. I'm going to go onto Amazon, find like secondhand versions of these books, or eBay or whatever it was, I forget. And I bought them and I read them. And I was like, this is really interesting. I can learn how to improve myself using books, using things that are fairly cheap and readily available to me. I can take in all of this knowledge, and it's really immediately applicable. Like, it changes my life in small ways and in big ways. So I did that, read some books. I stumbled upon a little podcast when it was on episode 6, I think, called Modern Wisdom, which is like one of the biggest podcasts on the planet today. But back then it was Chris Williamson sat in his house in the northeast of England interviewing obscure professors and people that we've never heard of over Skype. And there was just something about the way that Chris presented these complex ideas and the way that he made these different topics feel accessible that I really liked. And so I kind of went in a rabbit hole of modern wisdom and realized that the more books I read and the more content I consumed, the more I felt like I wasn't alone in this weird quest to go and improve myself. And it's probably the first time I even recognized that there was such a thing as self-improvement, right? The idea that your actions can be linked to positive outcomes when done correctly. And so I hired a personal trainer and I started going to the gym, and I would do really basic things like planning my days, like not sitting on Twitter all day, like being a little bit more accountable to myself. And it was really interesting because in the space of maybe a year, I went from feeling as though nothing was possible to feeling as though everything was possible. Like something just switched, and I thought, you know what, as bad as many things still were at that point, let's be clear, like just because that big cloud had lifted, like I still had no resources and no money and no connections and really no skills or ability. I was as ground level as you can get on almost every metric. But what did change in that period was the mindset that actually it's possible to go and make change. And I think really fondly of that summer, 2018. It was an amazing summer anyway, of like gigs, and I went on holiday with my parents and just nice memories with friends. I think the Euros or the World Cup were on that year as well. I remember sitting in a beer garden in Kettering watching one of the games. Like, it was just a nice time. But more than that, it was the first little clue that actually life might end up okay if I carry on down the path of putting intentional effort into things. And so that's what I began doing. And then I think the next chapter kind of follows on logically from that, which is, I've called it in my notes here, massive progress, because I don't think anything necessarily changed in my mindset in this particular chapter we're speaking about. But what did change is the intensity with which I went after things. And this is probably like 2019 until 2022, something like that, right? So the period which has COVID right in the middle. And having seen the positive results of the little experiments I was running in my life, whether it was not doing social media for a month, whether it was avoiding caffeine for a month and seeing what happened to my sleep, whether it was going to the gym really consistently for 9 months and having these mad before and after progress pictures, and knowing that the only thing that changed that body and that physique and that ability and that confidence was like the foods I consumed and the weights I lifted, right? It was a visual representation of what happens when you intentionally pour yourself into something. I decided to double down, I guess. I launched this podcast somewhere around that time. I started producing more content. I took the business more seriously. I started thinking of the business as this kind of vehicle to grow, to give me the life I wanted, right? So that lack of clarity I had in those dark days of not really understanding how people go from a place like where I was to a place like where I wanted to be, I realized that this leverage machine called a business was the thing that could one day get me there. And I think they were the most exciting years because it's that kind of big steep part of a curve on a chart. If you look at progress, right, starts off very flat because you don't know what you're doing and you don't really know much. And then you get this tiny little bit of progress. And it's when you lean into that, it's when you realize actually this progress is something that's addictive. And the more I put in, the more I get out. It suddenly skyrockets. And there's two reasons for that. Number one, it's exciting, so it's easier. But number two, the kind of newbie gains that you make at the beginning of any pursuit, whether it is financial, whether it's a skill, whether it's something like content, whether it's your career, whatever it might be, those wins at the beginning are the easiest to come by and the most obvious to spot once you have them. And it was things like this podcast reaching, I don't know, what would it have been back then, maybe 10,000 downloads. It was getting guests like Chris Williamson, who taught me so much in this weird parasocial way, onto the podcast, like Oliver Burkeman a couple of years ago, like Johan Hari, these people who in those books, in those podcasts that changed my life a few years earlier, being able to have a 2 hour long conversation with some of those people and feel like I was on their level. I blinked and they went from people on pages in books to people chatting to me and respecting me and seeing me as equal. It was doing really basic things like passing my driving test, like earning enough through the business to pay myself a little bit more, to start to have disposable income and start to build a bit of financial security, or at least financial certainty at that point, right? Because of our business model of retainers, once you have enough retained work, provided you're delivering on that work and offering a good service, you kind of know how much you're going to be earning in 6 months' time, because the contracts are in place, the direct debits are in place, and you just need to keep performing well for that client. So that kind of financial certainty came in. And then on top of that, if I'm honest, although this wasn't actually in the notes, my dad moving into a care home at the beginning of January, just before the first COVID lockdown, probably, it sounds terrible to say this, but there's a lesson in here somewhere, probably did me favours in the sense that he went from being at home where he wanted to be, but where he was less well looked after and probably less safe, and would be putting lots of stress and strain on my mum, who was doing her absolute best to look after him. He went from there to a care home that was designed to look after him with his needs in a way that was best for him, knowing that that part of the cloud had lifted. Again, probably allowed me to just accelerate even faster. Because in those early days of like really making progress a few years ago now, I remember everything feeling really easy and exciting. And like there was this novelty to everything. Like, wait, I can sleep with my phone on the other side of the room and that improves my sleep. Incredible. Like, put the phone over there, it takes 4 seconds. Suddenly you have much better sleep. Those low-hanging fruit are the things that really transformed my life. Because as much as the kind of later chapters of my 20s are the more adulty ones that we'll come on to, I think it was that kind of naive chapter, 2019 onwards, where as silly as some of the wins were, as silly as some of the progress was, because there was such huge leverage on some of those easy habits, those easy early wins, like not drinking alcohol, like not drinking caffeine after 4 p.m, like tracking my sleep, like drinking enough water, like eating the right foods, right? You can only get the big shifts in those once. And what I mean by that is, sure, there are health benefits to not drinking alcohol 8 years in, but you only get the immediate benefits of like not having hangovers and that being a new thing, having more money and that being a new thing, not having anxiety and that being a new thing. You only get those once. And so when you stack a bunch of those positive habits early on, progress feels really, really fast. But then the penultimate chapter of my 20s happened, which I've called here slow progress. And this was in many ways the most difficult chapter, because fast progress is exciting and exciting progress keeps you going, right? There is a sense of momentum. But eventually, as I learned in maybe 2022, there are only so many quick wins that you can win with before the wins get slow, before the leverage kind of wears out, before the levers become a little bit less long. Lots of buzzwords there, but you will understand what I mean. So once you've made all of that early progress, things get more difficult to replicate, or that the progress, the sense of progress, the sense of momentum becomes harder to hold on to, because you've used up all those big wins. To make a similar impact in your life, you need to, not earn your first £10,000 in the business. Great milestone, amazing. You need to earn your first £250,000. You need to not get your first 100 downloads on the podcast. You need to get your first 100,000. You need to not get like any guest that a publisher will give you. And it's so exciting, a publisher's giving me a guest, but actually you need to get the really big hitters, because you understand that the leverage of growing something like content is that's the game, right? And when I say that was the most difficult chapter, I don't want to compare it to the genuinely difficult days of the beginning of my 20s, because obviously it wasn't as difficult as that, but it's the one where I probably felt like I was most stuck in the mud. So from like 2022 to maybe like the end of last year, where I just kind of sensed that not things weren't worth it, because that makes it sound like I was back in that place I was years ago, but rather that I was putting in the same effort, I had the same mindset, but I wasn't getting the same results anymore. And it was at that point when I realized that I'd cashed in all of the small wins, right? This sense of being on top of the world because I was doing stuff had taken me to a certain point. But it took me probably 2 years to realize that it was not going to take me to the next point. It just wasn't going to. To speak on the stages I wanted to speak on, to get the guests I wanted to get, to grow the business to the level it's at now and the level it's going to be in a couple of years, I couldn't carry on with the same, like, I have a habit tracking spreadsheet and get enough sleep. I still do those things. I still think they're important, but what got you to this point won't get you to the next. And what got me to the point of feeling like I was invincible because I was making some progress just wasn't enough. And so the final year of my 20s, to kind of bring this all together when I think about it, I've called closing loops. And what I mean by that is none of the doing is worth anything if it's not leading somewhere. And so in the past year, particularly as I've been looking at turning 30 like I now have, I've been asking myself, well, what is this all for? And I don't mean that in some sort of like crisis way where I'm like, oh, what's the point? But rather, if I'm going to invest my time, which is absolutely flying by, I'm in a new decade of life now, if I'm going to invest my time into something, what's it for? What's the end goal? What am I actually doing it for? If I have a habit, sure, it could be a positive habit, but where is it leading me? Why am I doing it? And then beyond that, almost auditing my own excuses towards myself, my own limiting beliefs towards why I do or don't currently have certain things. So, for example, moving to the centre of Cardiff in this nice apartment that you see me in right now if you're watching the video version of this. I've wanted to do this for years, but it was only like a year ago where I'm like, if other people can do this, obviously so can I. There is a reason why I haven't done it yet. Let's look into that reason, interrogate whether it's true or not, interrogate the story I tell myself about that kind of limiting belief of why I can't yet do it, and then work out how to do it. Coming back with content, which seems ridiculous to say right now because I appreciate I haven't really been uploading this year, but lots has been going on in the background to make sure that next year things are incredibly consistent and much higher quality. I could have told myself the story of, well, it's just difficult because I'm busy and things are hard and da-da-da. But actually I closed the loop of like, no, something I want to do is be very consistent with what I believe to be reasonably high quality content and put it out there because I know it can add value. So rather than just telling myself I can't do it or waiting for another time, closing the loop of like sitting down and working out, how do I actually do this? How do I actually make this happen? And trust me, next year when you see it, I've made it happen. It's going to happen. The book, which got derailed for a bunch of reasons, like so many reasons you wouldn't believe, I might do another episode on that one day. Sitting down and being like, right, well, there is a deadline at some point in the middle of next year now. I apologize. There is a deadline by which that manuscript is going to be ready. And then there are clear steps for everything that comes after that to make sure that by the deadline I've given myself next year, that book is in your hand. Like you watching this right now, it's going to be in your hand because I've closed that feedback loop. And then it goes beyond that because it's kind of mindset feedback loops as well. Things that I needed to trust myself about, things that I needed to believe about myself, stories that I needed to unpick because of the beginning of my 20s, because of my childhood years, whatever it is, to believe that actually I can operate on a higher level. I can go beyond where I am right now because so much of what's going to come in the next decade is going to be in my head more than it is in the real world. And I'm going to talk about some ideas in a minute that kind of explain that a little bit more. But what I mean by that is the things that would hold me back in my 30s are the same things that are holding you back right now. It's hardly ever other people. It's hardly ever real things. It's hardly ever the actions of others or like physical. It's not physics, right? It's never physics that's stopping you from achieving your goals or following your dreams. It's always what's in your head. It's always the stories and the excuses and the insecurities and the doubt and the voices and all of that stuff. And in this past year, and it has been a struggle. Like, it has been a real struggle to do it. But in this past year, I say doing work, that makes it sound like therapy and formalized stuff. It's not that, but just really challenging those thoughts. Every time I think I can't do something, every time I think I'm not the person, or I think I shouldn't be in a certain room, or I think people won't take me seriously, or I think somebody knows something I don't, or I think they deserve it more, saying no, they don't. I'm going to get to where I need to get to because of me, and I'm enough already. That doesn't mean I shouldn't continue to improve. That doesn't mean I shouldn't be aspirational, but I'm already enough. And I think that that's probably the biggest loop that I've closed at the end of my 20s. I think that my 20s have taught me everything that they can teach me, everything they're going to teach me. And so I'm excited for my 30s. I've got a few lessons, I think I said at the beginning, that I want to share with you. And there are like 16 or 17 of these. There are quite a lot, but I'm going to try and fly through them. And I know I said already, but the criteria for these wasn't like sitting down for a day and planning what we're going to talk about. It was literally having a Google Doc in front of me for 5 minutes and asking myself the question, what have my 20s taught me? And then just typing down everything that came out, because I think that I could sit and ponder all day and make this like all intellectual and use buzzwords and sound like all of the podcast bros who say the same lessons, but it's not that. I'm not trying to do that. That's not what this is. I just want to think out loud on some of the things that I think this decade taught me, and that I think you would benefit from hearing, even though you're probably going to know all of them already, because that's how our minds work. It'd be useful for you to hear them again. So I'm going to jump into them. And the first lesson, and this decade of life has been testament to this, is that everything takes longer than you think it will. And everybody talks about this idea. Ironically, I just said that I'm not going to recycle everyone else's ideas. This is not an original thought, but everything takes longer than you think it will. And when I look at the beginning of my 20s, and I was watching those Gary Vaynerchuk videos and thinking I'd like to run a fairly kind of serious business. I would like to speak on stages. I would like to do content. I think part of the frustration, part of those dark days, part of the issue was that I couldn't see how to get there quickly. And so I assumed I couldn't get there. Or rather, the route there seemed so indirect that I sensed that I was the problem. But actually, the biggest benefit that I've had, like the biggest kind of thing I happen to have been born with that served me in my 20s is patience, is this weird ability. And I say weird because I don't know where it comes from. Like, I can't pretend that it's up to me that I'm built this way, but I am so happy doing something continuously over and over for years without seeing results, with no guarantee of results ever being there, just because perhaps it might pay off. And because I followed that path with everything from content to the business, personal finances, for a brief period of time when I was probably going to the gym, my physique and health, with running marathons, all of these things, because I have stuck at it, I've learned that everything takes longer than you think, but I've actually seen it through. And I think the real lesson there is in the, 85 to 90% of people, and I hope you're not one of them, who never see it through, because they don't realize that everything takes longer than they think. So when they're not seeing progress in 3 months or 3 years on a quest that should take a decade, they assume that they're the problem and they stop. They assume that they don't have the skills and they stop, or they assume that they're never going to get there and they stop. And yet, paradoxically, the only thing that stops them ever getting there is the fact that they stopped. Everything takes longer than you think it will. The second lesson, now this is a big one. This is kind of a meta theme of every piece of content I ever produce. I have this joke with my friends, which is that like every single video I've ever produced on the internet in the past 3 years has the same punchline. And it's essentially this, that action is the only thing that will fix your life. Because, believe me, I've spent plenty of days in my 20s feeling sorry for myself. I have spent more hours than I care to admit feeling helpless or hopeless, or been sitting up at 2 a.m. doubting myself or making up some story, right? And the time passes. You kind of tell yourself a story and feel a little bit better, but nothing changes. Nothing's fixed. Nothing's improved. You wake up the next day and the shit that upset you yesterday is the same today. And the reason for that is because what's lacking in that equation is action. And yet, when I look at my story, as weird as it is to say those words, because that makes it sound like I'm some sort of like role model, I don't think I am. But when I look at my story of the past 10 years of going from literally in a house without electric and food, with both of my parents earning no money, with me funding everything on this stupidly high APR credit card because it was the only way I could access money, and then it taking years for me to even pay that off, whilst struggling to grow a business, whilst being really insecure about who I was, to now blinking and suddenly 10 years later, things are okay, I'm okay, the business is going okay, I speak on big stages, I can sit and chat to a camera like this and have the leverage of the internet and it just feels fine. The only thing that's got me from point A to point B is action. Nothing else. Not handouts, not favors, not excuses, not kind of wishful thinking, not planning, not manifestation. Action. And the only thing that will get you from the place you are now to wherever it is you want to be, to wherever it is you deserve to be, to whatever life you want, the only thing that will ever get you there, no matter what anybody else tells you, is action. Is waking up and just going to do stuff. Is deciding what you need to do and then doing it blindly for longer than anybody else is willing to. Because you could give up. It's the easy option. You could. But you'll never, ever fix your life if you do. And if they get fixed, maybe you're already quite content with your life. Maybe there's nothing to fix, but you'll never get the life you want if you settle now. If you make the excuse. Action is this word which we all know the meaning of. Right? We all know what the word action means. And yet, so few people actually know the power of it, because so few people ever really, truly take action. Because action isn't going to the gym twice and then giving up. Action isn't saving a bit of money, then pulling it back out. And action isn't kind of half-arsing everything, but telling yourself, well, I tried that and it didn't work for me. That's not action. It might feel like action. Action is going at something with such blind determination. Right? So what's that quote? Stick to the plan, not your mood. It's sticking to the plan, not how you're feeling today. Right? It's disregarding how you feel today for the benefit of you tomorrow. That's a fairly good definition of action. So few people ever really take action, and yet everybody who does take action changes their life. Action is the only thing that will fix your life. And the next lesson is kind of related to that, which is that progress is invisible for like 90% of the time. Because if you think about that kind of growth chart of my progress in my 20s, things didn't really begin to change until I was like 26, 27. And I'm now 30 and things look okay. And yet when I zoom out by another 10 years, I'm going to realize that I'm actually really low down on the chart still. And they're going to continue to ramp up and they're going to continue to compound and things are going to continue to improve for me generally because of the action that we just spoke about. And yet on any given day, even on the most productive day of my life, it doesn't actually feel like I'm making progress. It doesn't actually feel like anything I'm doing is worthwhile or meaningful, right? I might finish something for a client, amazing. I might put out a piece of content, wicked. I might, get booked for a talk, that's exciting. But is that one client win enough to change my life? No. Is that one piece of content going to transform everything? Evidently not. Is that one talk going to suddenly open up another 10 stages for me? No, it's not. But when you chain enough of those things together, when you try and have more days when you have those little wins than those when you don't, eventually, when you zoom out, you realize that although the vast majority of the progress that you've been making has been totally undetectable in the moment, totally invisible, It was there all along, because on those days when something crazy drops into your inbox, or when you get that promotion, or when you marry that person that you never thought you could get, or you check your bank and there's another comma there, whatever it might be, you realize that it was never on that day the thing happened. It was in the days, weeks, months, years, in some cases the decades before. Progress is invisible until it's very obvious, right? This idea that when it rains, it pours. You need to continue as if you're making progress, even in the periods of time when it feels like you're not. You need to carry on taking that action, even when that action feels pointless and redundant, because most people stop when it feels pointless and redundant, and then their life becomes pointless and redundant, right? They never get there. Even if it feels right now like you're not making progress, so long as you can sit down and comfortably say that you're taking the right actions, you're doing the positive things, you are making progress. And one day you'll wake up and you'll look around and you'll realize that that progress is abundant and it's very clear to see. And it won't be on that day that it appeared, even though that might be the day you recognize it. It would have been in everything that you've been doing up until that point, so you need to keep doing it. 90% of progress is invisible, but it's always keeping score. The next one, kind of easy to explain, kind of hard. Tell your parents you love them, because you don't know how long you have with them. Now, fortunately, as I sit here and record this, both of my parents are still with us, right? But it's no secret, if you've watched content before, or even partially this here, that my dad is very ill and probably coming towards the end of his life with dementia. And it's crazy that I can even say that in a throwaway way, because I don't throw it away, but I'm just used to it now. It's my reality. But it hasn't always been that way. And, in some other universe, it wouldn't have been that way, but it is. Can't do anything about it. And then, if you've watched things like the vlog recently or the podcast prior to this episode, you'll know that my mum has had her own health challenges this year. And when I think back to the first, 22 years of my life, other than maybe when I was a toddler, but I don't remember, I don't think I ever told my parents I love them. I don't think I ever let it be known how much I appreciated everything that they had done for me and everything they were doing for me, and the sacrifices they made and the sacrifices they continued to make, and the fact that they put me first through everything, which is probably a huge part of who I am today and why I'm here and why I will continue to progress, right? I am my parents, you are your parents, for better or worse. I realized that I'd never thanked them. I'd never told them I loved them. I'd never sat down and had a real conversation with them about anything. I never took any photos with them or of them. And it was only through my dad becoming ill and seeing that condition slowly steal pieces of him, kind of brick by brick, that I woke up to the idea that our parents won't be here forever. Your parents, if you still have them, won't be here forever. And yet, so many of us, myself included back then, live life as if they will. They feel very permanent because, by definition, since the moment you were born, either one or both of them have been there. And if you're lucky, they are still there, but they will not always be there. And that's kind of the point. You have a chance now, today, literally right now, as you're listening to or watching this, to text them and tell you you love them. You can pop next door if they're there and tell them you love them. You can send them flowers with a little card through the internet. You can arrange a day out. You can phone them out of the blue and just have a chat. And it might feel a bit weird. It might feel a bit uncomfortable. You might not have that relationship with them, but I think now is always the best time to do those things, because one day you won't be able to, right? I remember, and this wasn't the last phone call I made to my dad, to be clear, but I always remember I was on the train back from London, and I must have been 16 or 17. And I remember phoning my dad and being like, oh, why isn't my £30 pocket money in my bank? I wasn't moaning, to be clear, but that was the content of the call, right? Very transactional, very on the phone, off the phone. I don't know why I always remember that phone call, but I do. And then a few years ago, I realised that I will never again, not once ever, see my dad's name pop up on my phone. That will literally never happen. He will never be able to phone me again, even though he's still here. And one day he won't be here and he will not be able to phone me. And so using that insight and how strange a thought that is to reconcile, it makes me phone my mum more often, right? It makes me check in with her more often, have random chats more often, make sure I answer when she phones, just try and be there a little bit more. And so if you have both parents, as conceptual as this probably feels through the internet, try and take my failing as a lesson for you to not make the same mistake, right? Try and connect with your parents more, speak to them more often, make more plans with them, because they're not going to be here forever. But the regret that you face if you don't get it right in the meantime will be with you forever. So tell your parents that you love them more often. The next lesson, somewhat related, is tell people how you feel. Now, the first, 23 to 24 years of my life was one long friend zone. And what I mean by that is I would kind of like a girl and get to know them, but I would always be too terrified to admit to them that I liked them. So I would kind of just float around for a few months, and then they'd get bored because they would read my lack of directness as a lack of interest, and then they would move on with their lives, rightly, as they should have done. And then I would be stuck in this loop of thinking that I wasn't good enough or I was the problem. And it probably took me, really, if I'm honest, until about 26, 27, to realize that sometimes you just need to be vulnerable and brave and tell people how you feel, because the problem was never that I wasn't good enough. The problem was never that I wasn't, attractive enough or charismatic enough or any of these things I thought I should have been optimizing for. The problem was that I just didn't tell people how I feel. And people are not mind readers. And this is the most basic advice ever if you're a competent adult, right? But some people still need to hear it. If you feel a certain way, the onus is on you 100% of the time to tell that other person. Now, that doesn't mean you always need to tell the other person. I'm not saying that you should say things that hurt other people's feelings. But what I mean is you can never assume that it is the other person's job to understand how you're feeling if you haven't first articulated it. And yes, this plays into romance and dating and getting to know people, but it also plays into every other area of life. If you feel a certain way, and it's right to do so, let it be known. If you think you deserve more, let it be known, right? There's this Dermot Kennedy lyric where he says something like, if you think just maybe it's her, then promise me, young man, you're going to let her know. And I always think about that because the number of girls who I really liked and we got along so well and I thought that we could have had a future together, and then they rightly and understandably moved on because I didn't say like one sentence. Right? And I can never prove the counterfactual, and all of these people seem happy in their lives and I'm happy for them. But a singular sentence to any of those people could have given me years of happiness, right? It could have been a positive force for everybody involved. And yet I just had this absolute inability to do it. And I don't know if you're the same. This point might be fucking weird for you, right? You might be able to skip straight over this one and be like, yeah, it's cool. Like, I grew up in such a way that I feel comfortable telling people how I feel. But for me, for whatever reason, and I have theories, we'll go into them on another episode, we do not have time today, I didn't feel comfortable. And as basic as it is, took me many, many years to get comfortable with it. It is a really useful skill to have, to be able to tell people how you feel. The next lesson, very simple. We can probably gloss over this one quite quickly. Trust your gut. So many situations in my 20s where my mind or my gut or whatever you want to call it has told me one thing and I've gone against it and thought, I was right all along, or I've wanted to pursue something because it meant a lot to me, but I was too shy. Here's an example, actually. This one is random, and this is probably something you don't know about me, even if you've listened to every episode of this podcast. In like 2014, 15, 16, 17, those kind of years, I used to love the idea of DJing, right? And I bought these like mixing decks and got my MacBook and plugged it in and downloaded the software. And I taught myself to DJ, to like mix songs, to make these like hour-long mixes. And I was fairly good at it, I think. Genuinely, I think I was fairly good at it. But in the moment, I was kind of always too afraid to publicly be like, yeah, I want to do this thing. And I uploaded some videos to Instagram and some little mixes, but I never really said with chest, like, this is something I want to pursue. And so I never pursued it. And I always had this memory of some guys who I was in school with, and I saw them on a night out, like 5 or 6 years after leaving school, I guess. And they walked past me, and one of them was like, huh, you're not a DJ, you're shit. And the other one was like, yeah, you're not a DJ. And it shouldn't have impacted me because, like, who the fuck are they? But it did, because it reinforced the idea that if I didn't trust myself to, like, go out there and actually try and do that thing that was a real passion of mine that I really enjoyed, of course other people were going to feel that way. Like, they must be right, because I feel that way about myself secretly. I didn't trust my gut to go for it. And then the reason I got all animated and excited a second ago when I remember this example is because I was sat with a friend like 4 days ago, and I went into my Instagram archived posts and found all of these little mixes to show them. And when I look back now, like, I was really, really good, like, genuinely really good. Really good. And it makes you wonder, right? Where would I have taken that in the almost 10 years since then? I don't know, because I didn't, but it's an interesting question. And then there was a guy, Danny Upex, he's a DJ from Corby, who has gone on to be a really good DJ. He was a resident at IB for Rocks in May this year, I think. Like, he's doing the thing, right? And he once, in the most, like, kind-hearted way possible, years and years and years ago, sent me a Facebook message, having seen my little videos on Facebook or Instagram, and was like, hey, I need someone to, like, do a back-to-back with me at this venue on this day. Do you fancy it? Like, the most pure intention message ever. But because I didn't trust my gut enough to have the confidence to be like, yeah, this is something I want to do, I let some sort of voice in my head tell me that it was awkward or embarrassing, or I wasn't good enough, or people would laugh. I can't tell you what, like, I don't remember. But I told him no. And it's just funny when I think back, and this isn't to suggest that, oh, in another world I could have been a DJ, because it was a passion thing more than anything else. But it's just a shame that I let that passion slip. And again, I pushed away any of that potential happiness because I didn't just trust myself to go and do it. And there are probably more serious, less fickle examples. I just can't think of them right now. But trusting your gut is something that's really important, because you know what you want. Deep down, even if you tell other people otherwise, even if you put on a brave face or kind of grin and bear certain situations, you know what you want. Your gut knows what you want. Your gut knows what's right for you, and you need to trust it. So trust your gut. The next lesson, this one is complicated, but run with me here. Don't over-index on certain areas of life despite what the gurus will tell you. Now, what do I mean by that? I spent way too much of my 20s thinking that the only thing I should optimize for was, like, productivity and hard work. And it got me somewhere, because here we are today. But I don't think I needed to lean into it as much as I did. Or at least I don't think I needed to lean into it at the cost of so much else. Right? I literally had next to no social life for years. Next to no friends I would see regularly for years. I didn't do anything that was fun. I didn't really have the first half of my 20s in the way that most people traditionally do, because I thought that I had to just lean into this one super lever thing that was transforming my life. And as you've probably heard for the past hour or so, I did it for good reason, right? It makes sense why I did it, but it's only on reflection. It's only with the kind of clarity of hindsight that I realized I didn't need to lean into it that much. I could have had a weekend off here and there. I could have not worked 12 hours a day here and there. I could have made more friends, or, I don't know, done more nights out, or had more fun, or allowed myself the kind of time and space to develop a romantic relationship, or any of these things that were the cost of entry for me to get off of that really low down level that I began, right? I had to drag myself from those dark days to get here. But there would have been a point halfway through that journey where things were stable enough for me to begin looking elsewhere at other areas of life, to begin building up, rather than continuing to build this taller and taller and taller ladder of, like, very siloed growth in one area of life, and then realize that I was lacking elsewhere. Because so much of the end of my 20s was not tearing down the productivity, get lots done silo, but trying to build other areas of my life up that frankly were lacking. It's only really the last couple of years that I think I've become a more developed person. And as is the case with so much of what I've covered today, lots of it can probably be attributed to just growing up, right? Like, most of this isn't me being some like really super well-balanced, virtuous person. It's just I'm getting a bit older and we all grow up as we do. But I think for too long, I over-indexed on certain areas of life at the detriment of others, and it made me a less balanced and probably, as a result, a less happy person. You're more productive when you have a life outside of work. I think that's the summary. So don't over-index on any one area of life. Next lesson. Recognize that you build your own luck. There's a chapter in the book about this, and it's probably something you've heard me speak about before, but for years I made the mistake of thinking that there were two types of people in the world. There were those who had luck on their side, and there was everybody else. And I thought that everybody in the have luck on their side camp were people who went out there and achieved things, or were given opportunities, or were kind of handed a career, or were just different, right? They must be different because they have things I don't have. So inherently they must be different because they did it somehow. And I attributed that really to luck. And I think most people attribute that to luck. And most people think that luck is buying a lottery ticket and happening to win, right? Most people think luck is this kind of singular chance encounter that happens unannounced. But that's not true. When you interrogate the story of almost anybody who's achieved anything, and I don't just mean financially or in a career, like look at the happiest married couples you know, look at the people who are the best parents. They didn't get lucky for those things. They built their luck. And I always talk about this, and it's in the book, but Ed Sheeran is one of the biggest musicians on the planet. Like him or hate him, you know who Ed Sheeran is. You know Ed Sheeran's songs. He's probably played your local 75,000 capacity stadium 4 nights in a row, right? He is huge. He is a big deal. Many people stood in the crowd at Wembley when he sells out 4 nights back to back would say he's lucky. Now, I would say he's fortunate because that's an incredible life to live, but I would say that he built his luck. He optimized for luck and he created his own, because before you knew who Ed Sheeran was, he played like 1,000 open mic nights in London. He tells this story of when he had just sold out a show, but the promoter had taken all the money because that was the arrangement he had, and he had no battery on his phone, and he had no house, and he had nowhere to stay that night, and he had no money to get a bus anywhere, and it was like 3 a.m, and he was stuck in London, having just done well by selling out a show with no money and nothing to show for it. He could have stopped then. He could have given up, right? He could have said, well, I'm just unlucky. But he just kept going. More open mic nights, more gigs, more YouTube videos on places like SBTV, more pushing, more action, to go back to that theme from earlier. And now he's Ed Sheeran, and there's 1,000 other singer-songwriters from the same period who probably had the same talent, who probably could have had the same opportunities were they have kept going, who stopped, who you don't know, who haven't played your local stadium. And the only thing that's different is he created his own luck. And the other story I tell in this theme is Warren Buffett, 90-something-year-old billionaire investor, co-founder of one of the most successful investment firms in history. You could argue that he's lucky, and he says he's lucky. He talks about this idea of the ovarian lottery, right? I forget the exact details, but he says that lots of his success is down to luck because he was born as a white male in a certain period of time, I forget when, with certain kind of things going on around him, which means that he was able to capitalize and get ahead, right? And totally correct, right? He won the lottery in the sense that he was born a certain way in a certain place during a certain time. Wicked. But I did the maths, and there's like 1 million other people who were males born into America in that year. And I think only 8 of them are billionaires, and none of them are as wealthy as he is. So what was different? Well, what was different is that not he got lucky, but he created his own luck. He read, if I remember correctly, something like 500 pages of reports and analysis every single day for decades of his career. And it took decades for him to make that one big investment that would eventually return billions. He didn't get lucky and become a billionaire. He created the conditions necessary to seem lucky and become a billionaire. And I think that's just a really important frame to look at all of your decisions and actions and the stories you tell yourself through. Are you actually unlucky? Are you actually oppressed? Are you actually really struggling in life? Or is it just that you haven't yet created the conditions for you to thrive, for you to get ahead? Right? You could think, oh, it's so unlucky that I work this job that I hate. Cool. How many jobs have you applied for in the past month? How many hours outside of work have you spent upskilling? How many things have you done that create the conditions to get what you want? If the answer is 0 or very few, you're not unlucky. You just haven't created your own luck. So recognize that you can build your own luck. And then this one's, again, slightly related. I've tried to put these in a logical order. It's slightly related, but it's not the same idea. And it is that you should feel like you're on the same level as your idols. And I don't mean be delusional. I don't mean think that you're Ronaldo if you can kick a ball. I don't mean it in a skill sense. I mean it in the sense that if you see yourself as different to the people you idolize, you fall into this trap of thinking that you can never make similar progress. And hey, maybe you can't, but if you tell yourself that story, you're never going to try, which means you'll never get anywhere. And some progress is better than no progress. Slow progress is better than no progress. And yet when you realize that every single person you idolize, whether they are footballers, whether they are the biggest podcasters or the TV presenters you really like, whether they're musicians or business leaders or just people in your community who you idolize or respect or want to be like or think have a cool life, whatever it might be, two things happen when you recognize, and that's the key word here, because you don't need to lie to yourself. This is a fact. When you recognize that in most important ways you are the exact same as they are, two things happen. Number one, you begin to make more progress inherently because you stop telling yourself the story that you can't do this or you're different to them. But number two, when you just act like a normal person to these people, right? The couple of times I met Stormzy, and it was in a really awkward, weird situation, right? Because it was at like album signings, which are the most cringe, contrived things ever. Rather than talking to him like Stormzy, the singer from Spotify, just having in one case, 10-minute chat like a normal person about stuff that we both find interest in. It's crazy how quickly you realize that they're like you and you're like them, and how much, this might not be the right word for this particular example, but like respect you get back from them for speaking to them like they're a normal person, for having a conversation like you would with your uncle or your teacher or that guy at the bus stop, right? The people I've had on the podcast who, if I'm honest, were a really big deal for me. The names I mentioned earlier are three good examples, right? Chris Williamson, Oliver Burkeman, Johan Hari. In their own ways, I adore all of their work. I've consumed hundreds of hours of Chris's podcasts. I've read every one of Johan's books. I've read all of Oliver's books. Really like them. Really respect them. But if you go back and listen to those podcasts, maybe not the first 10 minutes with Chris, because I was a bit nervous because it was a big fucking deal. But if you go back and listen to those podcasts, I wasn't treating those accomplished people as if they were different. I was just having a chat. And everybody got more out of it because of it. And it taught me that first crucial lesson, that those big authors, I'm writing a book, I'd like to be an author one day, they're just like me and you. That enormous podcaster, doing this podcast thing, it'd be good if it grew one day, just like me and you. So feel like you're on the same level as your idols, because you are. The next lesson, I read the word story on my screen. The next lesson is escape the stories you tell yourself. Now, this has been one of those meta themes throughout everything I've just spoken about, so I'll probably keep this one quickly, but it can be summarized something like this. There are stories that you tell yourself about who you are and where you come from and what you're capable of and what you're going to go on to do and how you're seen by others and how you should see yourself. And those stories are convenient in so much as they help you build a narrative of your life. They help you create this kind of self-identity which tells you where you fit in and where you belong. And sometimes those stories can serve you well because they tell you that you're good enough, or they tell you that you should take the action, or they tell you that you should try, but 9 times out of 10, the stories we tell ourselves do not serve us. They're not a kind voice. They're not encouraging. They're not pushing us forward. And yet, when you look at the stories in any level of detail, you realize that they're totally made up. Totally made up. You're not an unconfident person, whatever that means. You just haven't yet taken the steps to build confidence. You're not bad with money, whatever that means. You just don't yet have the systems in place to follow a disciplined budget. You're not unable to find a new job, or totally unskilled, or an idiot, or whatever word you'd use to yourself. You just haven't done the work to build the skills to get the other job, right? And there are a million examples that I can't think of right now. But the point is, every single piece of yourself that you dislike, you have associated with it a story that you tell yourself. And yet all of those stories that feed in to that sense of negative identity are totally fictional. They are totally made up. And because of that, there is literally nothing stopping you tomorrow waking up and just rewriting part of that story. Deciding, okay, I'm not confident, but I can be. So I'm going to take the actions of somebody building confidence. And then before you know it, you'll be a confident person. You'll have a new element to your story and chip away at every negative part of your life. Rebuild that story. Understand that in the same way that you can totally invent negative stories that limit your life, you can totally invent positive stories that push you forward. And so given the choice, why would you not? If you can either carry on with these negative stories, which are not getting you anywhere, evidently, right? Because they're still there. Or just flip the script and make up good stories about the things you can do and the things you will do and the reasons why you do belong. Pick the good stories, right? Escape the stories you tell yourself. That's the lesson. Next one. We're getting through this list. I am struggling, by the way. I have not done a podcast this long in a very long time, and this feels like a lot of talking. Next lesson. Do the uncomfortable things sooner. So much of my 20s was like 2 to 6 years delayed because I didn't just go and do the things that were uncomfortable. Whether it was the learning to tell people how I feel, building my confidence, putting systems in place to get better with my finances, despite the fact that short term that would mean having less money to spend. Whether it was passing my driving test, whether it was plucking up the courage to begin doing content, whether it was speaking up in meetings where I'd otherwise feel really unconfident until such a time that I realised that I could, whether it was getting on stages and speaking. Any of these things in the beginning were uncomfortable. And yet that discomfort was the price of entry to get past that point to then live a better life. And in any of those examples, as uncomfortable as they were in the moment to get over, I could have got over them far sooner by taking that exact same level of discomfort and just front loading it. And what I mean by that is, if you're terrified of public speaking, for example, and you think that public speaking might become an increasingly important skill in this AI world where so much is going to be commoditized, right? You may believe that, you may not. I do personally. If you feel uncomfortable doing public speaking now, you're going to feel just as uncomfortable in 2 years, or just as uncomfortable in 10 years. The only thing that's different is you would have lost 2 years of progress by delaying it. You would have lost 10 years of progress by delaying it. Uncomfortable things are always going to be uncomfortable. The level of kind of awkwardness and willpower and discomfort that is required to overcome those things is not going to lessen. There's not some sort of discounting that goes on across time where, oh, if I just avoid speaking on a stage this year and try and do it next year, it will somehow be easier. No, it will not. Anything that feels uncomfortable today that you would like to get over is going to feel as uncomfortable, if not more uncomfortable in the future. And yet the trade-off you make by delaying it is all of those years of progress and all of those years of improved life and all of those years of happiness that live on the other side of those uncomfortable things. And so if I could go back to my 20s, if you're watching this in your early 20s or even before that, do uncomfortable things sooner. It's such a simple sentence, but the impacts of actually living by that, using that as a mantra, do uncomfortable things sooner, can have huge, huge benefits on your life. Probably one of the most important lessons in this entire list is do uncomfortable things sooner. The next one, don't take anything too personally. This is so easy to say and so hard to actually do, so hard to actually live by. However, there will be situations in your life, as there have been in mine, where something doesn't go your way, or you miss out on an opportunity, or, I don't know, someone dumps you, or you don't do the thing you expected yourself to do, whatever it might be. And your mind's first thought is, this is your fault, or this is because of you, or this wouldn't have happened to somebody else, or there's some kind of unique personality trait makeup of you that means that that person did that because they don't like you, or they don't respect you, or you're not good enough. And yet I've come to learn that in almost every situation in life, most things aren't personal, right? If I were to have taken, as I did, I suppose, all of those kind of friend zonings in my early and mid-20s, personally, I would, as I did, assume that I was the problem. But in many ways I wasn't. I was in the crucial way that I didn't tell people how I felt. But when I say I wasn't, it wasn't because any of those like difficult to change, difficult to control, really scary things, right? It wasn't personal. It was just these people were like, well, this guy isn't giving me any sort of indication that he's interested. I'm going to move on with my life, right? It wasn't personal in that sense. If you miss out on an opportunity in a job interview, or you don't land a client, which we've been there a million times, or if something gets in the way of a big opportunity, like there was an enormous guest that was booked to come on this podcast a couple of years ago, and some nonsense happened, nothing to do with the guest to be clear, but some nonsense happened that kind of, in my mind, pulled that opportunity away from ever being able to happen. Not ever, but in the near future. And I'll be honest, I took it quite personally for a while. And then I realised it's not that deep and it's not personal. And people are going to do what they need to do in their own best interests. And that's fine. Most of the time, when somebody makes a decision against you, it's not because of you. It's because of them. Most of the time when it feels like you lost something or you missed out, you didn't, because that opportunity was never yours to begin with. If you didn't have it, if you never had it, you didn't lose. It was not a personal decision against you. And it just becomes so much easier to bounce back from negative situations and from failure and from all of these things that we don't like when you realize that most things are not personal. So, as hard as it is to do, and as easy as to say, don't take things too personally. Right, we've got 4 left. My voice is struggling here. I feel like a musician at the end of a gig. I've only been speaking for an hour. This lesson, bad things happen. Very self-explanatory, but very important to consider in any decade of life, right? I won't reel off the shopping list of bad things that I've been through because it is what it is and that's life and we're not here for that, right? We're trying to be a little bit positive and upbeat as we get towards the end of this episode. However, it's important to recognize that bad things happen because in a similar way to the previous point of not taking things too personally, when you realize that life will throw shit at you, things will be difficult, months at a time will get absolutely written off in a totally unfair way because of stuff that happened that you couldn't control and you couldn't stop and you couldn't avoid. When you realize that bad stuff happens, it allows you to just get on with life a little bit more. It allows you to, in the moment, realize that those bad things that happen also pass. But beyond that, it allows you to, when the time is right, stop and reset and move on, understanding that you're not uniquely disadvantaged because a bad thing happened. You're not destined to fail again in the future because a bad thing happened, right? Sometimes bad things happen. That is part of life just as much as the good parts are. It will happen just as frequently as the good things happen. You shouldn't treat this entire section of the pie chart of life that will be there for the rest of your life, that will continue to predictably and reliably happen. You can't pretend it's not there. You can't discount it. You can't just ignore it. Bad things happen. That's okay. That's part of life. Life is a feeling process. As I always say from the Big Sean song that I stole it from, life is a feeling process, and all of the emotions are there to be felt, not just the ones that feel good to feel. And so bad things happen. Feel how you need to feel in the moment. And with that understanding, it will help you bounce back far sooner. 3 to go. We're getting there. Can you see I'm making these shorter as we go? Because these were a lot. But third to last lesson is this. Focus on what you can control. Now, when I was typing away in this document with these lessons, I actually started this point in a slightly different way, because I was thinking about that little experiment I ran with myself just before I had Nero on the podcast a few years back, where I stopped reading the news. And it was around the beginning of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And it just felt like the news was this thing that was kind of consuming more of my attention than I would like it to have done. And I felt like a little bit anxious towards the idea of opening the news, and it felt like these things that were happening on the other side of the world were very real and pressing for me. Not to say they're not real, not to say they're not pressing, but they were not real or pressing to me because I live on the other side of the world. And so I stopped reading the news. Spent a month not consuming any news media whatsoever, had no idea what was going on in the world. And the weird byproduct is how I learned the lesson of focusing on what you can control, because once I stopped focusing on all the bad stuff that I couldn't control, a huge amount of mental clarity became immediately available for me to begin focusing on the things I can control, right? And this sounds really weird and conceptual, because how could the news possibly take up lots of your mental clarity, right? You're a well put together, self-actualized person. How could the BBC News website steal your mental clarity? You might think it can't. But the experiment I ran with myself of just cutting off all news media and all kind of negative, unimportant, uncontrollable stimulus, so places like Twitter as well, I unfollowed all the journalists and news accounts there. Once you don't have this weird fragmented attention where you spend 4 minutes caring about a particular war, then 6 minutes caring about a scandal, and then another 4 minutes caring about what that MP said, you have a lot more undisrupted time to worry about the things you can control, to care about the things you can control, to fix the things you can control. And this sounds obvious to say, because it is obvious to say, but you make a lot more progress in life when you focus on the things you can control. Now, that doesn't mean that you should only think about things you can control. That's weird. But trying to bring yourself back to a point where you ask yourself, okay, what can I do about this in any given situation? And broadly speaking, there'll be a few buckets, right? There'll be, I can't do anything about this, in which case, just move on. You don't really need to pay much more attention to that. I could do something about this, but I'm not willing to. That's more of a commentary on your values, and there's no right or wrong answer there. But if you're not willing to do something about the thing that's currently consuming your attention, that's just as good as a problem that you can't fix, so move on. And then there'll be this bucket of things which you do care about and which you can control, and you should put all of your mental energy and attention into that list of problems, the things that you do care about and you can control, because you'll have much greater mental clarity in the process and get much more done. So focus on what you can control. Final 2. And the second to last lesson is actually directly stolen from Steve Jobs. Let's be clear, this is not my idea. However, it is something that since the age of probably 22, I want to say, I have lived my life by this. And everything we've just spoken about is testament to the fact that in his wisdom, Steve Jobs hit on one of the most important human insights I've ever heard. You can only connect the dots looking backwards. Now, in those dark days, when I was sat in that house, sorry to dwell on about it, but we're doing it for effect this time because you'll see where I'm going. I sat in that house with no electric, with no way to pay the internet bill. It was freezing, there was very little food, there was lots of stress. But I had this idea of the kind of person I wanted to be, and I had this idea of the kind of life I wanted to live. I could not connect the dots looking forward of how to get there. And because of that, I had that kind of apathetic approach towards life, right? It's not to blame myself, it's a very human approach, but, I didn't look after myself. I didn't do the best for those around me. I made no progress. I ate rubbish foods. I couldn't get out of bed for days on end. I could, like physically could, but I just didn't want to. Like my head wasn't there. I just felt like I didn't want to move because getting out of bed made it real. Because none of my problems were there when I was asleep or lying in bed. All of my problems were there when I left that bedroom door, right? If I could see a route forward, if I could see a way to fix those things, or at least a mindset that would allow me to realize that eventually I could fix those things, I would have immediately taken the action. And you're the same. If there's a part of your life that you don't like right now, the only thing that's actually stopping you, I think, from going and fixing that thing is that you don't quite know what you need to do yet to get there. So what's the point of like straying off in this weird direction if it's not the right direction? But Steve Jobs says this thing where he says that life is about making dots, right? Each dot is a decision or a thing that you do or an opportunity you take up or somebody that you tell you need to move on from, whatever it might be. And looking forwards, as you plot these dots, you can't see where you're going. You can't see where they're all taking you, right? I could not see in those dark times how I'd get to be sat here right now doing what I'm doing. As far as I still have to go, this is good progress in 10 years, right? I'm happy to say that. And yet when I look back, I can connect all of the dots. How do we know? Well, I've just done it. I've literally just told you the story of the past decade of my life and how I went from that place to this place. I couldn't connect the dots looking forward. You can connect the dots looking backwards. You can only connect the dots looking backwards. And that's one of the most fundamental and important mindsets you could ever have in life, because it doesn't give you any more clarity looking forward of where any of these dots are taking you, but it gives you the belief that if you continue to make those dots, and by dots here I mean like take the right actions, do positive habits, take opportunities, say yes to things, push yourself out there, do the uncomfortable things, all the stuff we've just spoken about. If you continue to do those things and plant those dots blindly, you might not see where you're going. The 90% of that progress might feel invisible, but you are going, and that invisible progress is there nonetheless. And then when you look back in a year or 10 years, or at the end of your life, whenever that might be, you'll have this really clear story to tell of you took that job and then you met that girl and then the two of you moved into that house and you met your best friend who lived next door, and then you went on that holiday, and on the holiday you met somebody and you started the business, and you know there will be these random, unconnected kind of serendipitous dots that looking forward made no sense, that got you nowhere. And yet when you look back on them, they make all of the sense in the world because they become your life. And they get you to the most important place possible, which is the place you want to be, which is the place you deserve to be. So you need to keep moving forward because you can only connect the dots looking backwards. And then, very final lesson. This is something that I struggle with, in the sense that there are lots of people who, for many of the understandable reasons that we've spoken about today, don't push themselves hard enough in their early 20s. They don't try hard enough. They don't make the progress they could. And so I feel conflicted in the sense that it's too easy for me to say that they should push harder, or they should try more, or they should be more effortful, whatever it might be. But with all of that said, if there's one thing I wish I did more as a teenager and in so much of my 20s, is realize that I was young and that most stuff doesn't matter. And so to just have more fun, right? I think I took life too seriously for too long. And it looks like the cost of making the progress I've so far made is that I had to live this very regimented, boring life. And to some extent I did. But like we said earlier, to some extent I really didn't. And so if you're the type of person who's into this kind of content, who reads the books, who listens to the podcast, who expects a lot of yourself, hold on to that. Never expect less of yourself. Never think that you should change for others because they're telling you that it's uncool to make progress, or you should just go and do the night out and vape, bro. Like, listen to those people to an extent, ignore them to an extent, like make your own decisions. But in everything you do, continue to have fun whilst you can. Continue to lean into your, and I mean this in a nice way, I promise, deeply unserious life whilst you can, because things get serious very quickly. And oftentimes, those serious developments in life are irreversible, and they reshape the direction and cadence of your life for the rest of your life. And yet, when you have that freedom to just go and live, and do what you want, and chill and have fun and have very little consequences in your teens and probably up to like 25, right? Maybe grow up when you're 25. That's probably a good measurement. But until then, just be young. Don't worry about finances too much. Don't worry about finding your person, because spoiler, you're probably going to be a totally different person by the time you're 30 anyway. So like, it's not that deep. There's all these things that, if you're the kind of person who's into self-improvement, because everything is so pressing right now, because you want to make the progress now, it can feel like everything matters right now. And most stuff, honestly, it doesn't matter right now. You got time. And so I'm not saying take your foot off the gas. I'm not saying become some waste man or go and begin terrible habits that will impact your health. Obviously, I'm not saying that. But I'm just saying that in amongst it all, whilst being the rounded person that I'm sure you are, whilst making all of the progress that I'm sure you're capable of making, just make more time for yourself, have more fun, and be young whilst you still are, because I'm old now. I'm in my 30s. I think that's a good place to leave this. Look, this has been weird, kind of growing up on the internet to a very small handful of people who listen to these podcasts and watch the videos and get in touch and all the stuff I always say. I really appreciate every single one of you, because, I mean, I'm not sure I'd listen to this podcast now, but I certainly wouldn't have listened to it 6 years ago at the beginning. So I appreciate everyone who has been here for the entire time, for one episode, for anything in between, or if this is the first one you've ever listened to. I'm glad you're here. It's amazing that you got this far. This is a long episode. The podcast will be back properly in the new year with a regular release pattern. There's lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of work that I've been doing on the systems and the back end stuff to make sure that the content is not only consistent, because that's one half of it, but just stuff that I'm really proud of and stuff that I'm really happy to stand behind. And you've probably seen a lot of that of this short form stuff over the past few months. Like, that's almost where I need it to be, and it's growing as a result. You would have seen a couple of YouTube videos here and there, which is me trying to get back into the cadence of it, and then the podcast will be back in the new year. But this is it. I'm 30. The next podcast you hear will be me just getting on with my life as a 30-something after 6 and a bit years of documenting my life as a 20-something. I'm excited for my 30s. I have said before in the vlog recently that I think my 20s have taught me everything that they were going to teach me. I think that those chapters of life that we just spoke about, as painful and difficult as some of them were in the moment, were all really useful, because we're shaped not by the good stuff that happens in life, not by the easy moments, not by when it's all going well, but by the opposite of all of those things, right? When things are difficult, when things are bad, when it feels like you don't have a way forward, that's what shapes you. And some might call it unfortunate, some might call it fortunate, but lots of that has been loaded into my 20s, and just by pure chance has been mixed in with this kind of positive naivety towards life and this willingness to do things for longer than everybody else. And it served me up until this point, but I'm ready to just take it all up a level in this new decade of life, because a decade in many ways is a very long time, right? It feels short because it feels like only yesterday I was 18, but in the same breath, those dark days, as I keep calling them, and I promise I'll stop calling them that after this episode, it was just for the kind of story arc, those dark days feel like another lifetime ago. They feel recent in some way, sure, but if I ignore the passing of time and how quick that has felt, I'd rather look at a decade through the lens of how much can change in that time. And I wasn't even getting things right for the first 60-70% of this decade, but nonetheless, like, how much can change in a period of time that feels fast. As quickly as I am hurtling towards old age now, it feels, now I'm in my 30s, like crazy. It doesn't even feel real to say it. I know that this decade a lot because I've learned all the lessons from my 20s. I've built the foundation in my 20s. I've taught myself that I am capable in my 20s. And now I get to go again. Now I get to wake up tomorrow in my 30s and have this 10-year blank slate in front of me. 10 years worth of making those dots that will make sense in retrospect. 10 years of doing the difficult things sooner. 10 years of realizing that action will change my life. 10 years of building my own luck. 10 years of continuing to be young and continuing to have fun. I'm excited. Normal upload on YouTube next week, which is probably the next time you'll hear from me. And then in the new year, the podcast is back and we get on with getting on. Thank you again, as always, for listening and for being here. Have a good Christmas. Have a good New Year. And I will see you in 2026. See you soon.